Some graves are guarded by soldiers. Some require checkpoints to reach. Some can only be visited on certain days by certain people under strict control. Tombs, not battlefields. Under stone and concrete, under centuries of conflict, lie the bodies of biblical figures, men and women who shaped nations, faith, and everything that followed. Of the 7 most sacred tombs in Scripture. Where are they now? Abraham, Moses, Joseph, Rachel, David, Samuel, Aaron. Death wasn't the end of their stories. One of them was buried by God himself, and no one was allowed to know where. One man's own legal claim to the Promised Land, and people still fight over it today. No one planned for these tombs to become battlegrounds, but memory has weight, faith leaves marks, and in Scripture, death won't stay quiet. The places where these men and women were buried still shape borders, prayers and identities in 7 stories, and a world still divided by where the dead are buried.
Moses spent 40 years leading a nation through a wilderness. He watched the Red Sea tear itself apart at God's command. He stood barefoot before a bush that burned but was never consumed. He carried the law down from Sinai, etched in stone by the finger of God himself. Few men in Scripture stood closer to heaven, and yet, when the time came for Moses to die, something happened that has unsettled readers for thousands of years. Deuteronomy chapter 34 tells us that God led Moses to the top of Mount Nebo. From that height, the Lord showed him everything: the Jordan Valley, Jericho, the hills stretching north and south, every inch of land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The destination Moses had marched toward for 4 decades. And then Moses died there, on the mountain. But here is where the story breaks from every other burial in Scripture. God himself buried Moses. No funeral procession, no grieving family, no monument carved by human hands. The text is disturbingly specific. The Lord buried him in the valley, in the land of Moab. And then it adds a line that feels intentional. No one knows where his grave is to this day. This was not an oversight. This was a decision. Israel mourned for 30 days. They wept for the man who pulled them out of slavery, the man who stood between them and divine wrath, the man who shaped them into a nation. But they were never allowed to stand at his grave. Why? Because God understood something about human nature that history keeps proving again and again. We turn leaders into relics. We build shrines around bones. We confuse the messenger with the message. Moses was already larger than life. His face had once glowed after speaking with God. Scripture says he spoke with the Lord face to face. If his tomb had been marked, it would not have remained a grave. It would have become a pilgrimage site, a place of veneration, possibly even idolatry. So God removed the temptation entirely. And centuries later, the mystery deepens. The book of Jude reveals something Israel never saw. The archangel Michael himself disputed with the devil over Moses' body. There was a spiritual battle over his remains, a conflict hidden from human eyes. Every other leader in Scripture left behind a tomb. Moses left behind a law, a covenant, a people forever changed. His legacy was not tied to a location. It was written on hearts. If Moses' grave was hidden to protect faith, the graves that followed were marked for the opposite reason. So future generations would remember Joseph died in Egypt, not in Canaan, not in the land promised to his great-grandfather Abraham. He died in the same empire where he had once been sold as a slave. And yet, by the end of his life, he was the second most powerful man in the world. Genesis 50 records his final moments. Joseph was 110 years old. He had seen children and grandchildren grow. He had lived long enough to witness God's faithfulness unfold across generations. And as death approached, he made his brothers swear an oath. God will surely come to your aid, he told them, not if, when. And when he does, you must carry my bones up from this place. Joseph believed in a promise he would never see fulfilled in his lifetime. He believed Egypt, for all its wealth and power, was not home. So they embalmed him, they placed him in a coffin, and there he remained for centuries. Then Exodus 13 changes everything. Israel is fleeing Egypt. The plagues have fallen, Pharaoh has broken, an entire nation is moving in panic and urgency, and in the middle of that chaos, someone remembered. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. Think about that. With slavery collapsing behind them, with an army potentially closing in, someone stopped to honor a promise made 400 years earlier. Those bones crossed the Red Sea. They wandered the wilderness for 40 years. They traveled alongside the tabernacle, alongside the Ark of the Covenant, alongside the very presence of God. Joseph had saved Egypt from famine, but his bones were preserved for Israel. Finally, Joshua 24:32 records the end of the journey. Joseph's bones were buried at Shechem, on land Jacob had purchased centuries earlier. The soil his family once walked. Joseph came home. Why does Scripture devote so much attention to the movement of a dead man's remains? Because Israel was not just carrying bones, they were carrying their future. Every time that coffin appeared, it declared something dangerous to forget. God keeps his promises. What he speaks over one generation, he fulfills in another. Even when circumstances say you will die in a foreign land, faith insists you belong somewhere else. Joseph's body stayed in Egypt for 400 years. His hope never died. Those bones were not relics. They were prophecy in physical form, a declaration that God's people were going somewhere, and that he would not forget them along the way. Joseph did not leave behind a throne. He left behind faith, and sometimes coming home takes longer than a lifetime. Rachel was loved deeply, visibly, unforgettably. Jacob worked 7 years for her, and Scripture says those years felt like only days because of his love. When he was deceived into marrying her sister first, he worked 7 more, 14 years, for one woman. The kind of love people write songs about. But love does not exempt anyone from suffering. Genesis 35 tells us Rachel was traveling with Jacob through the land of Canaan. She was pregnant, and the journey was not over yet. As they journeyed toward Ephrath, the place we now call Bethlehem, Rachel went into labor. What should have been a moment of hope quickly turned into fear. This was not an ordinary birth. This was the kind where the midwife knows something is terribly wrong. As Rachel struggled for breath, the midwife tried to steady her panic. "Do not be afraid," she said. "You have another son." Rachel had waited years for children. Her first son, Joseph, was the answer to prayers whispered through tears and disappointment. And now, as she brought another child into the world, she was dying. With her final breath, Rachel named him Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow, a name born out of pain, out of grief, out of the unbearable weight of leaving her children behind. But Jacob could not let that name stand. He renamed the boy Benjamin, son of my right hand, a name of strength, of favor, of hope. Even as death stood nearby, Rachel died there on the road. There was no time to return to the family burial site, no journey back to the cave of Machpelah where Abraham and Sarah rested, where Isaac and Rebekah lay. Her death was sudden. The moment demanded immediacy. So Jacob buried her there, beside the road to Ephrath. He set up a pillar over her grave, a marker of stone, so that anyone who passed would know, here lies Rachel. She is the only matriarch not gathered to the family tomb, not by choice, by circumstance, not by dishonor, but by the brutal unpredictability of life and death. Her grave became a landmark. And generations later, the prophet Jeremiah would give Rachel a voice. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children, a poetic image of a mother's grief that refuses to fade with time. Even in death, Rachel remained bound to the sorrow and the hope of her people. Today, Rachel's tomb still stands, or rather, a structure built over the traditional site still stands, and like so many ancient graves in this land, it has become something else entirely, a point of separation. Walls divide access to it. Different communities claim her memory. Checkpoints decide who may approach to pray. The grave of a woman who died bringing life into the world now sits behind barriers that keep people apart. A monument meant to mark love became a line of division, but perhaps that is not the whole story. Perhaps Rachel's tomb, isolated, unfinished, interrupted, still speaks a deeper truth. That grief is real, that not every journey ends as planned, that sometimes we never arrive where we thought we were going, and even then, God does not forget. Rachel died on the road, but her memory outlived the journey. David was the king who turned Israel into an empire, a shepherd boy who killed a giant, a warrior who united the tribes, a psalmist who gave Israel its songs. He was called a man after God's own heart. When he died, Scripture records it almost quietly. David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. 1 Chronicles adds that he died at a good old age, having enjoyed long life, wealth, and honor. His son Solomon succeeded him. The kingdom stood firm. But here is what is strange. The Bible never tells us exactly where David's tomb is. We know he was buried in the city of David, the stronghold he conquered and made his capital. But Scripture stops there. No landmark, no detailed location, no description of the tomb's entrance or its chamber. For the greatest king in Israel's history, that silence is unsettling. Other kings have burial places described in far greater detail. David does not. Over the centuries, tradition tried to fill the gap. By medieval times, a site on Mount Zion became associated with David's tomb. Pilgrims came, prayers were offered. It became sacred to multiple faiths. Yet, archaeologists remain uncertain. The original city of David lies on a different hill, south of today's Old City. Excavations have uncovered walls, tunnels, water systems, but no confirmed royal tomb. So where is David really buried? We do not know, and maybe that is the point. David's legacy was never meant to rest in stone. It was written in the Psalms, sung by every generation, sealed in the covenant God made with his house, a promise that his throne would be established forever, a promise pointing forward to a greater son of David, a king who would reign without end. David's body lies somewhere beneath Jerusalem, but his influence shaped the entire course of Israel's faith. Sometimes, faith preserves meaning even when history loses coordinates. People still visit the traditional site. They still pray, they still connect, not because the location is certain, but because the story endures. David was a man who loved God fiercely, sinned deeply, repented honestly, and left behind words that still give voice to worship and longing thousands of years later. You do not need to stand at his grave to feel the weight of his life. David's uncertainty teaches what other tombs cannot. That devotion can survive without certainty. That faith does not require a map to every sacred place. That sometimes not knowing where someone rests allows us to carry them everywhere. David was buried in his city, but his songs traveled the world. And in the end, that is a far greater monument than any tomb could ever be. Samuel lived between two worlds. He was the last of the judges and the first of the prophets who anointed kings. He stood at the hinge of Israel's history. For generations, Israel had been led directly by God. But now the people wanted something else. They wanted a king, like the other nations. And when they demanded it, Samuel gave them what they asked for, not because it was right, but because God allowed them to choose. Samuel warned them what it would cost. He told them a king would take their sons for war, their daughters for service, their fields for officials. He told them they would cry out under the weight of the very power they demanded, and God would not answer. Still, Samuel anointed Saul. And when Saul's disobedience disqualified him, Samuel anointed David in secret, years before David would ever wear a crown. Samuel was the voice of God in a generation learning to navigate power politics and the painful gap between what people want and what God requires. When Samuel died, all Israel mourned. 1 Samuel chapter 25 records it with startling simplicity. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. At his home. Not in a royal tomb, not in a monument, not in Jerusalem. Samuel was buried where he lived. There is something deeply fitting about that. He never sought power, never ruled from a throne, never built his name around a location. His legacy was not stone, it was faithfulness. Even this burial carries uncertainty. Scripture tells us he was buried in Ramah, but scholars have debated for centuries where Ramah actually was. Multiple sites claim the name. Different traditions defend different locations. There is no universal agreement on the coordinates, and yet people still gather. Depending on which tradition you follow, different communities honor different resting places. Some sites are shared, others are divided by access and control. Just like the other tombs we've explored, what makes Samuel's burial significant is not where it is what it marked. When Samuel died, an era ended. The age of the judges, chaotic, cyclical, marked by repeated failure and deliverance, came to a close. The age of the monarchy began. Israel would never be the same. Samuel's death closed one chapter and opened another. He had warned them about kings, and everything he warned them about came true. Yet Samuel understood something most people struggle to accept. God works even through choices he warns against. His purposes do not collapse when his people insist on their own way. Transition is painful, but it is often necessary. Samuel was buried at home. His voice echoed long after his death. And sometimes being buried where you lived is enough, because the life you lived speaks louder than any monument ever could. Aaron wore the garments of holiness for 40 years. He stood before the altar, entered the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, carried the names of the 12 tribes on his chest, engraved in stone, every time he came before the Lord. He was Israel's first high priest, Moses' older brother, the man whose staff budded with almonds as proof that God had chosen him, and Aaron failed. Numbers chapter 20 tells the story. Israel was complaining again, this time about water. They were thirsty, angry, ready to return to Egypt. God told Moses to speak to the rock, and water would flow, but Moses, pushed beyond endurance, struck the rock twice instead, and Aaron stood beside him. The water came. The people drank. The crisis was resolved. But heaven was not silent. God's response was immediate and final. Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Moses and Aaron had led the people for decades. They endured rebellion, complaint, and fear. They carried Israel out of slavery, through the sea, through the wilderness, and now, within sight of the promised land, they were told they would not enter. Not long after, God gave Moses another command. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar up Mount Hor. In the sight of the whole community, remove Aaron's priestly garments and place them on Eleazar. Aaron was about to die, and his priesthood was about to pass on. So they climbed the mountain together. Moses, Aaron, Eleazar, 3 men ascending, only 2 would return. At the top, Moses removed the sacred garments, the breastplate with 12 stones, the ephod, the robe, the turban with the golden plate that read, Holy to the Lord. Everything that marked Aaron as the one who stood between God and the people, and he placed them on Eleazar. Aaron died there on the mountain, in full view of the camp below, close enough to see, too far to reach. The text says the entire community mourned for Aaron 30 days, the same length of mourning they would later give Moses. Aaron carried a burden few ever understood, the weight of representing a holy God to a stubborn people and representing a stubborn people before a holy God. Aaron spent his life standing between a holy God and a difficult people. And like Moses, he saw the promised land from a distance. He came so close. He walked every mile of the journey, endured every complaint, carried every sacred responsibility, and yet the consequence of one moment, one failure to honor God's holiness in the way God required, meant he would never cross over. Aaron wore holiness for 40 years, and he died seeing the promise, but never touching it. The priesthood did not die with him. It continued through his son, through his descendants, through generation after generation, until it reached its fulfillment in a greater high priest, one who would enter not an earthly tabernacle, but heaven itself. Aaron's life reminds us of something uncomfortable. Leadership has a cost. Privilege and responsibility are inseparable. Even those who serve faithfully can fall short of God's standard, and sometimes our role is not to finish the journey, but to carry something sacred just far enough for someone else to complete it. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, later called Hebron. She was 127 years old. Genesis 23 pauses to show Abraham's grief. He went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep. Then something unexpected happened. Abraham stood up from beside his dead wife and went to negotiate. At this point in his life, Abraham was still a foreigner in Canaan. God had promised him the entire land, told him to walk its length and breadth, and yet, after decades of obedience, Abraham did not legally own a single piece of ground. Not until Sarah died. He approached the Hittites, who controlled the land, carefully, respectfully. I am a foreigner and a stranger among you," he said. "Sell me some property for a burial site so I can bury my dead." They offered him any tomb he wanted, free of charge. They honored him, respected him. But Abraham refused. He did not want a favor. He did not want generosity. He wanted ownership, permanent, undisputed, recorded. So he negotiated for a specific place, the cave of Machpelah, owned by a man named Ephron, along with the field surrounding it. In typical ancient Near Eastern fashion, Ephron offered it as a gift, publicly, in front of witnesses. Abraham insisted on paying. Ephron named the price, 400 shekels of silver. The text makes it clear. This was inflated. Abraham paid it anyway, without hesitation. The transaction was witnessed. The terms were public. The sale was binding. For the first time in his life, Abraham owned land in the Promised Land, not through conquest, not through inheritance, through burial. He carried Sarah into the cave of Machpelah and laid her to rest. That cave became more than a grave. It became the first physical anchor of God's promise. Abraham himself would later be buried there. So would Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, the patriarchs and matriarchs, the family through whom God promised to bless all nations, were gathered in that single cave. Machpelah was not just where they died. It was where the promise took root in the soil. Consider the weight of that moment. God told Abraham his descendants would inherit the land. Abraham spent his life in tents, moving, waiting. He could have died owning nothing. Instead, he claimed the land for his death, not for his life. And in doing so, he made a declaration. My people belong here, not temporarily, permanently. Centuries later, that cave still stands. Or rather, a massive structure built over it still stands. And it has become one of the most contested sites on earth. Access is divided. Times are restricted. Armed guards control entry. Prayers are offered in separate sections. The same cave that holds the fathers and mothers of multiple faiths has become a symbol of division. Violence has erupted there. Blood has been shed within feet of where Abraham rests. The site meant to represent God's promise to bless all nations has become a flashpoint of anger, pain, and unresolved grief. The first piece of the Promised Land was claimed through burial, not conquest. And thousands of years later, people are still fighting over it. Abraham did not buy that cave to prevent conflict. He bought it because he believed God's promise was worth anchoring in the earth. He believed his family's future was tied to that land. Machpelah was an act of faith, a declaration that God's covenant was not abstract. It had weight, location, permanence. Even when everything else was uncertain, Abraham ensured his family had one place they could always return to, one place where they belonged. 7 tombs, 7 stories, 7 moments where death became more than an ending. Moses was buried by God in a hidden grave, so Israel would worship the law, not the man. Joseph's bones traveled for 40 years, a living reminder that God keeps his promises across generations. Rachel died on the road, her grave marking love and loss in equal measure. David rests somewhere beneath Jerusalem, his songs outlasting the certainty of his location. Samuel was buried at home, closing one era and opening another. Aaron saw the promise from a distance, his priesthood passing forward. And Machpelah became the first piece of the Promised Land Abraham could call his own, a cave that still divides the world. These graves were never neutral. They carry weight. They hold memory. They anchor identity. And here is what all of them reveal. Faith outlives monuments. Moses' influence did not depend on pilgrims. Joseph's hope was not tied to Egyptian soil. Rachel's love did not require walls. David's legacy was not locked in stone. Samuel's faithfulness needed no coordinates. Aaron's priesthood did not end with death. And Abraham's covenant did not stop at the mouth of a cave. God's promises do not depend on where we are buried. They depend on what we believed while we were alive. These tombs still shape the modern world, not because of where these people died, but because of how they lived. Some graves are hidden, some are uncertain, some are divided by walls and checkpoints and centuries of pain, but the faith that placed them there transcends every barrier. And there is one tomb that does not belong on this list, because it holds no one. Its story begins where death ends. To understand what happened to Jesus during the 3 days after the cross, click the video on your screen, because God's promises were never about graves. They were always about resurrection.